Welcome to Train Signal. I'm Mel Haynes, and in this video, we're going to look at a very important topic. We'll look at some of the tools that are available to you for monitoring your SQL Server environment. Yes, that is something you will spend quite a bit of time doing because you want to prevent problems before they occur by keeping track of how the resources in your box are being used. Plus, on some occasions, it may be, oops, something's wrong. I need to quickly figure out what is wrong. And we'll look at some tools for that as well. But here, our topics will include, first of all, the activity monitor, which is typically your starting point when you want to assess the state of your SQL Server box. We'll look at trace flags. Now, trace flags are kind of something you're going to find sprinkled throughout your support approach with SQL Server. You'll find trace flags related to replication, or trace flags related to mirroring, or trace flags related to various features and components of SQL Server. Next, there are built-in SQL Server reports that you can just pull up and look at the results. There's the Job Activity Monitor. Anytime you're using the SQL Server agent and any of the jobs under it, the Job Activity Monitor is the best place to look to see what's going on with your jobs. When was the last time it ran? When is the next time it's supposed to run? Have the runs been successful? SQL Server logs. There are a series of logs that are kept within SQL Server. Plus, the viewer we're going to look at within SQL Server will also show you logs that are just more generic for Windows. So we'll see all of that. Database or data management views, rather. I always want to say database management views, but it's simply data management views and simply DMVs for short. These are a family of built-in views in SQL Server that give you information about the state of your server, and they can be a lifesaver in the event there's something catastrophic going on with your box and say users can't get in to access the information and you can't even log in. Well, I'll show you a way using another tool right here, the dedicated administrator connection, that lets you get in when other people still can't. And then one of the primary things you'll probably use that dedicated connection for is to view your data management views to see what's going on with my server. So let's jump right in with Activity Monitor. For SQL Server 2008, they've completely redesigned the interface, giving it a more of a dashboard type of a look, and that's a term you can actually see in the documentation. But it's divided into 5 main sections, and they are the overview section, which I have expanded right now on the screen, and we'll look at the other 4, but they are the process section, the resource weights, data file I/O, and the recent expensive queries section. But here, looking at those in a little more detail before we jump in. Once again, the overview section, as you saw, gives you your graphs and your charts. So it's a good first line of defense when you're trying to determine what's going on with my SQL Server box. Why is my performance slowing down? Next, we have our processes section, which will give you the status of any given SQL Server process. It'll give you things such as the session ID, who initiated the process, the database that it's using, as well as the SQL command that the process is running. So very helpful information. Next, we have our resource weights. And when I say resource, I'm talking about things such as my CPU, my SQL Common Language Runtime, CLR, network and buffer I/O. On how many occasions is a process or a task having to wait for a resource to become available? That's another key indicator that can tell you where your bottlenecks are. If it's CPU, obviously, you have a problem with not having enough CPU power. Next, we have our data file I/O section, which is separate from network and buffer I/O. It's going to display I/O activity for both your system and your user database files. And then last on the list, we had recent expensive queries. What are the queries that are hogging up my resources? I can get those ranked by system utilization. Gives me a place to start for trying to determine how to optimize my system. But here we've talked about them from a high level. Let's jump over to our SQL Server box and look at these each in turn. So here we'll go to Start, SQL Server Management Studio. And I'm just going into my local server, click Connect. And if I right click on the actual server name here at the top, the option about a third of the way down is Activity Monitor. click on that, and it brings up my activity monitor in whatever screen real estate I have available, which isn't much. So you probably want to get rid of your object viewer there on the left so you can see this thing. Pretty handy tool. It's basically maximized, and it has 5 main sections: my overview, my processes, resource weights, data file I/O, and recent expensive queries. Now the first section is open by default. You could have closed it and see other sections if you need the screen real estate, but it's open by default, and the idea is to give you a quick picture of what your system looks like. Now mine's pretty blank right now, right? I'm not doing a whole lot in this environment. It's a test environment. If you right click on these, there's other information available, such as I can set the refresh interval. Right now it's set by default to every 10 seconds. I can pause it, or I can just manually refresh it. Now when you're looking at this, the first question that comes to mind is, well, what should it look like, right? That depends. It depends upon your environment. And my recommendation is, when you set up your SQL Server environment, the first thing you want to do is bench line it. What is my initial starting point? And then go back and do that again as things change in your environment. So I've set up the environment. What does it look like from the get-go before any users are on it even? And then look at it again at a minimal utilization time, say just before 8:30. Most of your users aren't in place yet. Or if you have certain applications that run at certain predefined intervals, look at what the system looks like when they're not running. Look at what the system looks like when they are running. And you want to use those numbers as your bench line, right? Now what you want to do with that information is then compare what does it look like at the different times of day, as well as what do the values look like, or how do they change over time. This can give you some idea as to, okay, we're running out of processor. We're starting to maximize our processor, so you might want to look at upgrading processors. Why are we seeing a lot of waiting tasks? Are we doing something with new applications on the network that are causing a lot of tasks to have to wait? Why is my database I/O going up? Am I starting to tax my amount of RAM available? So these are some of the things you want to look at and evaluate. The second area gives me a list of my processes. I can filter any one of these based on a particular ID. In this case, this is a process ID, a particular user process. I have a choice of a 1 or a 0 for user process or system process. All I have is user processes right now. My logins, my database, you can see the rest of the list. If you right click on any one of these, it gives you more information, such as a details section, where you can see additional details of, in this case, that login. So I can see what exact SQL statement is used. If I want to, I don't recommend that. You could kill the process from here. Be careful about killing processes till you understand very thoroughly why they're running, right? That's true for Windows. It's also true for SQL Server. So I'll close this. You can see what database. I can see I'm running things against my master and against my temp DB. The state, what command am I running, but lots of really helpful information about the environment. That's typical information you're going to find in a Windows environment. All the way down to this workload group. Workload groups have to do with Resource Governor. With Resource Governor, you can create what are known as workload groups for organizing the work, right, in your environment. If you choose to not use it, right, you're always still in a default workload group. So that's why you see here default. So I'm not using Resource Governor at this point, so I just have my default group. Resource weights, I can see more information about any waits that are occurring. Once again, that's important to note. If you see a lot of processes having to wait for other processes to complete, you'll want to look at, hey, what's hogging my resources and slowing everybody else down. Data file I/O, as with almost any operating system, if you're seeing a lot of file I/O, chances are you need more RAM. That's kind of a general rule of thumb. SQL Server, Windows is no exception to that rule. So I can see which database is doing it, right? So my temp DB, even my model DB, right? The file itself, and then the actual statistics on reads, writes, and response times. And then recent expensive queries. If you've noticed that your system is slowing down perhaps every day at a certain time, you want to jump in here, see what my recent expensive queries are. Perhaps there's some application or some user running some particular report that's causing a major hit on your system. If it's one of the top 10 currently happening, then you know there's something that you want to look at, possibly rewrite that query or maybe run it at an off-peak time so you're not impacting other users and other applications in the environment. But that's your activity monitor. And as I said, one of the first things you'll want to do with this is use it as a tool to benchline your environment. Talking about trace flags. Trace flags are going to be used to set specific characteristics in your environment. You can turn things on, turn things off that allow you to track what's going on in the environment, diagnose performance issues, debug your stored procedures and other computer systems. They're commonly used. Many times you won't find a lot of information about them. I found that when I get stuck on a problem with SQL Server and I talk to someone with more years than oh, turn on trace so-and-so. I'm like, trace so-and-so, where'd you get that from? Well, I just knew to do that. And that seems to be kind of the trick with trace flags. They're almost like this black magic that every now and then you'll come across a trace flag number that doesn't seem to be documented. And I've come across that many times, unless you're looking at a specific feature of SQL Server and they may mention that trace flag. I'm not going to try and cover every trace flag for you now. That would be like teaching you the dictionary and I'd lose all of you. But I did want to give you a high-level understanding of what trace flags are and some basic things to know as far as applying trace flags. Keeping with that, trace flags can be global or session in scope. What do I mean by that? If you turn on a global trace flag, those settings now impact every database running in that instance, as opposed to a session scoped trace flag will only apply to that particular instance and that particular process ID. When that process ID goes away, that setting automatically goes away. Sort of like a local variable. Same thing, like local variables and global variables. Some trace flags can only be run globally, some can only be run locally. If you attempt to switch that and run a global trace flag as a local or a session trace flag, you don't get an error message, which can be extremely frustrating because you think you've set a trace flag and you're not seeing any results. Not until you go back and look more closely at the trace flag do you figure out, oh, this thing can't be run session scoped. It has to be global, right? So that's one thing to note. If you accidentally try and flip it the wrong way, you get nothing. You get no feedback telling you that you did not successfully activate the flag. All right? Types of trace flags, again, they're session trace flags. These are active for the connection, are visible only to that connection. A trace flag that is enabled at the session level never affects any other sessions, all right? So other sessions that are running simultaneously on the same server will not be impacted by it. And once again, any effect of that trace flag goes away when that process goes away. And then global trace flags, these are set at the server level and they are visible to every connection on the server. And you can enable those simply by using the -t command. But here's what that would look like. Simply dbc trace on with a -t saying it's global. And then I give it the number of the particular trace that I want to enable. So things like 2528, yeah, that's what they look like. And once again, that's why I'm not going to take you through the entire list of trace flags. I would bore you to tears. But I did want to give you these general characteristics that you'll need to be aware of. And then turning them off is simply dbc, trace off. And you can get the status of your current trace flags by simply saying dbc space trace status. And it'll list every trace you currently have enabled. Jumping into SQL Server reports. SQL Server 2008 comes with a huge list of predefined built-in reports. If you right-click on any object in the Object Explorer, you'll get a little pop-up menu, of course. Click on Reports, go to Standard Reports, or Custom Reports actually, and you can see either your standard list of reports or go into an interface where you can load up a pre-built custom report that you've built with some reporting tool. You have reports for performance monitoring. You have reports related to your resource usage. And as I said before, depending on what you click on will determine which reports you see. And they have reports based on server level scope as well as database level scope. But here, let's jump over to the server, and we're going to hit upon a few key reports that you will probably want to have in your tool bag. So let's look at some of my SQL Server reports. Here at the top, already highlighted, I have the instance name for my SQL Server box. Right-clicking there, going to almost the end of the list is a reports menu and an option that says standard reports. I will just pull up one of them right quick, the server dashboard. Kind of a handy but generic report, giving it a few seconds to retrieve data, and it gives us a nice little graphical layout. Just a general overview of what's going on with my server. So on the left-hand side, I have things surrounding CPU usage. On the right-hand side, logical I/O operations. Interesting numbers. Now this is dynamic. It's showing my MSDB is at a huge percent, almost 75% of CPU utilization. That probably isn't going to last very long. If I refresh this, that's gone way back down. So I actually caught this, it looks like, right at a moment where I was just running some job, right, using SQL Server Agent, and it kind of hit a spike. But that typically shouldn't be taking up a huge percentage of your CPU usage. So that was a pretty cool catch, right? But other activity details, I can see my active sessions, transactions, what databases are currently active, how many of them, a total memory. So just kind of generic information. I can even see my server collation from here, right? Now here, let's go back. I right-clicked on the instance name to get to this list. I'll go ahead and get rid of that. We're done with that one. But I also want to point out that list is dynamic, because if I go to my Veronica's database and right-click there instead, go to Reports, Standard Reports again, and notice I see a different list. I don't have that overview as the first option. I have a disk usage, however, which, giving it a few seconds, gives me some more charts. Total space used, data file space used. So pretty handy information to have, and I can actually drill down and see more information on those in some cases. See exactly what partition I'm on my primary file group here. Logical file name. So pretty handy stuff, pretty generic stuff you can get to in several different places from SQL Server. I can even go in and see disk file usage per table. Let's go back to Standard Reports, right? Top 10 tables, usage by table. So it can slice and dice the information lots of different ways for you. And as you may have guessed, in this environment, my client flower match table is actually #1 in records, but actually #2 in size. My customers are the largest bulk of my information. In a production environment, you would probably see this number a lot larger, my orders number a lot larger. Now that's depending on whether or not you're archiving information over time, which is usually a good idea. Say orders over 5 years old, you've not had any activity with a particular client or any changes to an order, you might typically archive that, so this information would go down, and this could be a report you would use to determine when you need to make that decision. If you see your orders table at a substantially higher level than it typically is at, you can say, hey, what's going on? Go back, check the dates of some of those orders, and say, hey, it's time to archive. So those are some of the things you can do with this information. But right-clicking one more time, so looking at that list again, Reports, Standard Reports, and as I said before, there's quite a few in here. I can see top transactions by age, all blocking transactions, so if there's any blocking going on between different types of competing processes, I can see that kind of information here. Information around my indexes, usage statistics, physical statistics, user statistics, so lots of easily attainable reports that are already built for you. Now, you've got this report in your head that you need to build, and it's not to be found anywhere in the standard list. You can build that. There is a custom reports interface. Now, we don't have any custom reports in here, and we're not going to get into that. It's a little bit out of scope. But I did want to point out that you can create your own RDL file, as they're called actually, report definition language file, and create your own reports. I'm working with SQL Server 2008, pre-R2, release 2. R2 is due out probably in the next few months, and it actually includes an update to the Report Builder tool. I'm currently running at Report Builder 2.0. Report Builder 3.0 will be released coming up, and that's the tool you will use for creating these report definition language files. Just want to point that out. That's another topic for another time, but just wanted to let you know where that's at. So closing all this down, that's some of our pre-built reports. Looking at the Job Activity Monitor. Job Activity Monitor is going to give you information specific to your SQL Server agent jobs. So here in my Object Explorer, now in this picture it's not actually running, as you can tell by the red icon, but if it's running that would be green. And if I expand that group, I eventually get to a Job Activity Monitor. Double-clicking that brings up this interface. Here I can see a list of all the jobs that I have running. The only thing I have going on right now is log shipping in this particular diagram, so I see things related to that. I can tell if the job is enabled, if it's currently running or idle, its status, information about its run history, category information, but everything you need to determine the health of your jobs. Why are my reports not being generated? Why are my backups not there? I can look in my Job Agent Monitor and get quick answers for those types of questions. If you have questions around your job activity, you have a Job Activity Monitor that'll get you directly in and focused on that information. If I go to SQL Server Agent, now mine's already running. I'm refreshing my box obviously several times in order to make some of these recordings. And you may be in a virtual environment too. You may have restarted. If this is not green, you probably want to right click, go ahead and click Start and get it going. And if you've only recently set it up, you may not have any activity yet in your Job Activity Monitor. Now, we've been playing with quite a few different tools as far as high availability. I've done some things with log shipping, replication, talked a little bit about clustering. So I've got lots of different things that could possibly be running under my jobs. Typically in a production environment, you won't be using all of them. You could be using a combination of them. And that is the case right now in our Veronica's environment. The only thing that's actually going right now is my log shipping, LS backup. So I can see a list of the jobs that I have here. And this isn't intended to be a SQL Server agent discussion yet. I really wanted to focus on the Job Activity Monitor. Just wanted to give you a little background for that. But if I double click on the Activity Monitor, it populates almost instantly. And I can see all the jobs again. Same list as over here. I can see if it's enabled, its current status, when the last time it ran, and was it successful, right? Or the outcome rather. Here's the last time ran, so there's a time and date stamp on that. When is it scheduled to run again? So all that kind of information is easily attainable for your various jobs. And of course you can refresh this, or in the case of a much larger list than I have, you can filter it. And then looking at my SQL Server logs. That's actually a big category because SQL Server maintains a myriad of logs inside the server environment. So for example, if I expand the management folder, there's an SQL Server logs folder. Those are logs specific to the server itself. Notice it says current, and then underneath that I have 6 additional folders that say archive 1 through 6. That's a default configuration where it keeps 6 archive and 1 current. When does an archive drop off? Every time a service is restarted, it creates a new archive, then an old one starts to drop off this active list. If I want to see the contents of any of those logs, just double click on them and it opens up my log file viewer. And here I have checked SQL Server and I can see that I clicked on the current log, so it immediately took me to the information for that current log. And if I wanted to, I could add in the information from the archives by clicking on the check boxes here. Okay? Now other things to note. I also have access to logs related to database mail, SQL Server Agent, as well as the Windows NT environment. Now I recommend that if you click on the box for Windows NT, that be prepared to wait because you're going to probably have a lot of different information in that log and it'll take a while for it to load all of that. So once again, I have server logs, we have agent logs related to the SQL Server agent, we have job history logs. Looking here, I can see logs specific to my job history. Any of these logs can be viewed using the same interface, our log file viewer, which is quite handy because I can then combine or focus on specific subsets of my logs. when we're looking at the server logs, once again, there's one default or current, and then 6 archive, and these are all automatically maintained. A new server log is started each time an instance is started. And as I mentioned before, your Windows logs are also available within the log file viewer inside of SQL Server. Let's go over to the server and actually look into our SQL Server logs. If you go to your Management folder here in your Object Explorer, expand that. Notice there's a folder that says SQL Server Logs. Expanding that, I can see a list of the 7 current logs that SQL Server keeps automatically. It automatically gives you the last 6 archived and then a current. And I can see what's in any of these by just double clicking or right click and choose open. And it gives me also a chance to look at all of them combined, which is kind of nice, or any subset of them. I could actually see my SQL Server agent information here as well. I choose to leave that out, as well as my OS related stuff. So I can combine all the logs together, and that's a newer feature for SQL Server. Expanding this, I can see the result of my various backups. Once again, the time that it occurred, any messages for any problems. I don't have any problems showing up here, which is probably a good thing for production environment. It's a bad thing for demoing, but if there were a problem, I would see a big red not sign here if something had failed. But currently everything's looking good and flowing like it's supposed to. Talking about dynamic management views and the function categories, SQL Server provides a huge list of DMVs as well as built-in functions that you can use for gathering information about all types of aspects of the system. Here's the complete list from Books Online, and I wanted to spend a little time walking you through and talking to you about each one of these. So hopefully this won't be a snooze session, but it's some good information that you should at least familiarize yourself with at a high level, so that later on when you're delving into fixing a specific problem, you'll have some idea of what are the players and the pieces you have to work with. So starting with the change data capture. Any type of data change that's occurring in SQL Server is being tracked. Of course, you have the log files, but also the DMVs are also looking at every single change that occurs and keeping records of those changes. There are roughly 3 DMVs under this category. We're not going to look at all of the subcategories, but I do want to give you a high level. Next, the CLR, or the Common Language Runtime. For those of you who are developers, you are probably very, very familiar with and at home with the CLR. But that's the interface, the programming interface to SQL Server, allowing you to create various .NET components that build upon the SQL Server base. The Common Language Runtime subset also includes a relatively small number in that it only includes 4 functions for working with and viewing the CLR data. The database mirroring section will give you information about your various mirroring sessions that you have set up, keeping track of the status of those mirroring sessions as well as the players in those mirroring sessions. Next, you have database, which includes about 5 dynamic management views that'll give you information on things such as file space and session space usage. The execution section. The execution section will give you information regarding things that are actually running right now, such as background job queues, cached plans, various connections being used, your cursors, anything going on right now in the system. You'll be able to find that kind of information in the execution section. Next, you have your full text search section. If you're familiar with full text search, you're somewhat familiar with the kinds of things that go on with that, such as indexing all the text that's provided to the full text search. So you'll find information related to that in that section. There's an index section for helping you manage and keep up with the statistics of your indexes, utilization, the changes and sizes of those indexes. You have the I/O section. In this section, you'll have information about what's going on as far as, obviously, right, I/O, but things such as pending I/O requests, you'll find that information there. Anything going up with your backups. If you're dealing with clustering, you'll find things related to your clustering there as well. Looking at the object subcategory, when we're looking at the DMVs, the object subcategory actually only has two subcategories under that. If you're looking at any of the entities inside of SQL Server, everything in SQL Server is an object. Functions are objects, store procedures are objects, tables are objects, databases are objects. But if you think about the list that I just gave you, some of those are objects under objects. The DMVs related to objects help you navigate that hierarchy by showing you what objects are components of other objects and what parent a particular object can belong to. So it gives you a two-way path through that object hierarchy. Under query notifications, this is actually an extremely small subset. If you were to query that one, you would find out there's only one function underneath there. It's the DM_QN subscriptions function. And all it does is give you information about the active subscriptions in your particular server or a specified database of interest. So it's a very small subset, but it does deserve its own category. There's a replication section where you'll find things related to articles for your replication. And then the resource governor section gives you information about your resource governor configuration, your various resource pools that you've created and workload groups. That types of information will be available to you in that section. Looking at Service Broker, you'll of course find things related to the messaging that's associated with Service Broker. The SQL Server Extended Events subsystem is actually a new feature for SQL Server 2008. This part of the DMV is associated with a new extended event handling subsystem in SQL Server that is actually used for troubleshooting. It allows you to collect a manageable amount of information about your environment for troubleshooting. And here in the DMVs, you can hold that information and then query that information as needed. After that, we have SQL Server Operating System, which is one of the larger subcategories. Here, you're going to find a huge number of views and functions related to memory and managing your various instances, things that look at the actual stacks that are being managed under the hood, your addressing, so a lot of operating system related stuff. You're going to find DMVs and functions related to that. And then with transaction, you'll find things, of course, related to managing your transactions, things related to snapshots and transactional things going on in SQL Server. And then last but not least, of course, security. So anything related to your database security, such as your encryption keys, things related to your cryptographic providers and the various properties of those providers, various algorithms associated with those cryptographic providers, and actually some of your auditing information will also be stored there. So that was the high-level overview. Just wanted to give you one page of here are the dynamic management views and functions. But we want to actually see how would we apply that in our particular case. So let's move over to our server and utilize them for monitoring our Veronica's database. So let's start by going to our database folder, expand that, go to my production Veronica's database, expand that, and if I go to views, I'll see a system view folder. Other than that, there's not a whole lot in here because I don't have any other views that I've defined, but SQL Server, on the other hand, has defined automatically an entire library of built-in views. And if I scroll down to the sys.dm section, I'm in my dynamic management view section. So I can see there's quite a few of those listed here. So let's say I want information about my indexes. If I go to the DM_DB section, I have a index usage stats view. Other things under here, I have views related to mirroring, partitions. But let's look at the usage stat. I'm just going to right click on it for now and just let SQL write my SQL. Select the top 1,000 rows. Move this over so you can see it. Bring it up a little. But I've got back some information. I got a database ID number, which isn't really that helpful unless you've memorized all the database ID numbers, but I'll show you a way around that. But you could probably guess a 1 is your master database, but we'll be able to confirm that in a bit. Here's an object ID within that database. Then there's the index ID. And now here's the usage information for that database. User seeks, user scans, lookups, updates, timestamps of the most recent user seek or scan, on down the list. Now I have a lot of nulls here. That could be a good thing, that could be a bad thing. How do you know? Well, you want to benchmark your environment. What's normal in your environment? Because it's going to vary depending on the utilization of your system. Now in my case, there really isn't much traffic on this database. It's just me here hacking away at it, demoing how to build things. But in a real production database, you're going to see very few nulls in this table. But here, let's work on readability a little bit, because I want to get rid of that database ID number. First of all, the top 1000, this is a relatively small table, so I can go ahead and grab the whole thing. And I'm going to use some built-in functions. There's a db_name function. Put that in with an opening and closing paren, and rerun this. And now I get database names. And for readability, let's add one more thing. Actually call it that. Database name. Right? So you want to make it as user-friendly as possible. This might be a good example of, depending on your environment, a piece of code to save and rerun at regular intervals. Depends on what kind of issues you're seeing with your database. So that's using a dynamic management view, but we've also talked about dynamic management functions. So here, let's run a piece of code. It's pretty short, so we can just type this in. So if you're following along, just type what I'm typing here. Select star from sys.all_objects. Go ahead and enter on that. Where name like, and we want to specifically tell it to look at the dynamic management stuff, and we know all those names have somewhere in them DM followed by an underscore. So just do that. %sign saying anything in front of it, anything after it, single quotes. And there's more in that table other than just those functions and views. So we want to specifically tell it we only want functions and views. So by using and type is in this list. If type is v, that's a view. We already played with the views, but we'll show them anyway. And if type is if, you guessed it, that's a function. One last thing, let's order them by, I don't like hunt and peck. Order them by type. Didn't need the square braces around that, obviously, right? But just to be safe, so SQL doesn't confuse it with a built-in reserve word. And running just this, F5, bring that up a bit. I get a list of all my dynamic management functions, followed by a list of all my dynamic management views. And it actually gives me both the type here and then the description. Lets me know it's a view and a function. Cool stuff. So here, let's pick one of these. I'm going to go with index related stuff again. So db index physical stats. I'm going to run that. So the syntax will be a little different because it is a function. So I'll do a select again. Star from sys.dm_db_index_physical. It's figured out which one I want, so I can hit tab to finish that out. Give it an open paren, and the first thing it asks for is database ID, but we're not into memorizing database ID, so we're going to use a built-in function that'll take the user-friendly name and find the ID number for us. So using the db_ID function, open paren, and then give it the string, the name of my database, comma, moves on to an object within the database. Once again, it wants the ID, which I don't know, but I can use a function to look that up as well. And I'm going to look at the sales.customers table, comma again, And now for the object within there, I want to look at my primary key index, my PK_customer. Object ID again. I don't know that number. I'll look it up. And I give it the user-friendly name of PK_customers. Comma again, it wants the partition number. I don't know and don't care. I don't need that for this example, so we'll just give that a null. And then the last one, though, is the mode. You have a choice of 3 different values for mode. We're going to go with detailed. Gives you, obviously, the most detailed amount of information about this index. The other 2 choices would be limited or sampled. And I didn't do those in the right order, really. Detailed will give you the most amount of information. Sampled is in the middle. Limited will give you the most limited results. So if you have a really large database, you may want to go with a limited. I have a relatively small database and I need to see all of it. In this case, I'll say detailed. Give it a closing paren. Give myself a little screen space. Go ahead and run that. And it doesn't like what I typed. First of all, it's not IB, it's ID. Change that. And actually, I know there's one more problem with this. I'm kind of intentionally having it blow up on me. Could not find the table or index ID. It could not find this table in the database it's looking at because I still have it pointed to master. So let's go ahead and change that. That was the last thing. This time it should give us what we want. And I get to see for database ID 5, that's my Veronica's database. Object ID, this number here, that's my sales customer table. Index ID 1, that's my PK customer index. It's on partition 1. Its type is a clustered index. Other information about it, the allocation unit, type description, index depth. So this is a 3-level index currently. That's a dynamic value based on how much information is in my database, right? And at the different levels, it's giving me information about that level. Way cool. So for index level 0, I've got an average fragmentation in percentages of just under 0.5, right? Fragmentation count, average fragment size in pages. So this is the kind of information at a very detailed level that you can utilize to evaluate the health of your SQL Server database. Cool stuff. Once again, there's an entire library of functions here. To go through each and every one of these functions would be like teaching you the dictionary. Instead of doing that, I'm teaching you how to look it up for yourself. So as I mentioned before, you have functions, you have views. This little piece of code is actually pretty helpful for just seeing everything in one place as well as looking in the system folder. The names are somewhat intuitive, so that helps. And then, of course, books online will give you more information about the 200 or 130 plus DMVs available to you. Using SQL Server audits. Auditing in any IT environment can be crucial to basically protecting yourself from legal action in some cases. In the case of our environment with Veronica's, we don't have a lot of highly sensitive information here, except for possibly one piece of information, and that's credit card information. And in the case of any organization, there's always the possibility of some unscrupulous behavior. So we can't block all access to credit card numbers. That would defeat the purpose. But we do, of course, want to, 1, limit who has access to that information, and then 2nd, audit anytime it's been accessed. So that's one possible use for audits in our environment. Another case could be simply to track our backups and make sure they're happening as they need to. We can actually place audits on our backup process and then verify that all of those backups are occurring. In SQL Server 2008, auditing is implemented using 2 objects. First, there's the audit object, and then there's the audit specification object. Neither one accomplishes the job in and of itself, but it's the 2 of these together and then the various properties on these objects that we can set that allows us to audit various components of the SQL Server environment. Auditing involves a few steps. First of all, we need to create that initial audit object. Second, we need to create the audit specification and then link it to or tell it to use our audit object. Third, we need to choose a target to audit. Are we auditing logins, successful logins, failed logins, or backups? Fourth, we enable the audit. And then fifth, we have to go back and review the captured audit events. Now, that's not something that necessarily happens at the same time. The first 4 steps are all part of setting up auditing, whereas the last one is something you will do over time. But let's jump over to the server and actually enable auditing of our SQL Server backups. So here, let's look at auditing. First of all, I'm in my server environment again, expanding my security folder, and second from the bottom is audit. So we'll start there. If I try and expand that, there's nothing there yet. I haven't created anything, but if I right click, I have an option to create a new audit. So go ahead and select that. It gives me a default name based on today's date and time. You could go with that if you like cryptic names. I like things a little more descriptive. Let's say in this audit we're going to be tracking backups. I'll simply call it that. This is my audit object. Next, I have a value for queue delay, the maximum amount of time to allow before I force the audits to be committed. If I put that at 0, for example, that would mean synchronous. It would immediately queue write all audits without any delay. That could be a performance problem. So leaving that at a default of 1,000 is good for what we're going to be doing. Shut down server on audit log failure. Interesting option. If I were to turn this on and attempt to write to a file, and let's say the file isn't there, or the file I don't have permissions to write to that location, that would cause my audit to fail, and it would actually, because of this, cause my server to shut down. That's a feature you'd only want to use in environments that have very strict auditing requirements. You know, an environment that says either give me information about everything that occurred or stop everything in its tracks. So you have a choice there to make between the ultimate in auditing, nothing gets by, or providing service to your users. So something to look at, but we're going to leave that off for now. Destination, you have a choice of either file, writing into the security log, or the application log. And of course, if you choose either of the second two, it automatically disables the file location. I'm going to write this into a file, and then I'll go ahead and pick a path. I'll just put it in our course files folder, location we're working with. Select that. Click OK. Now, of course, you'll want to put that someplace secure. Putting it on the same drive where my database and everything else is located is not what you would want to do in production. We have one location to work with. Maximum rollover, unlimited, was what it initially defaulted to. How many files do I want to create before I start to reuse those files? That goes hand in hand with what is the maximum file size. And right now, I have it set to, say, I'll go with a small file size of 2 megabytes. All right. And the other thing I can do is I can reserve disk space ahead of time, or have it allocate space when it needs it. But if you want to be sure you have that 2 terabytes of space, right, you can go ahead and allocate that up front. So we're going to change this to, say, 3. Go ahead and click OK. And I've created my backup audit object. Go ahead and enable that now or later. I'll enable that. That was successful. And now I need to create my server audit specification. So the specifics of what will go into determining when I write to this log. Going to the server audit specification folder, right click. Again, there's a new option. Select that. Gives me a default name again, and I'm going to add something more descriptive. I'll just add the word backup onto this again. And now I'm going to select what audit object. I only have one. It's the backups audit object. Now, how would I use multiple audit objects? Simply, if I need to have different audits written to different locations, the information that I configure when I configure this audit object is associated with that object. If I want some information written to a Windows log, some information written to a file, those differences would have to be assigned using different audit objects. Here, go to Audit Action Type, scroll down to Backup Restore Group, select that, click OK, and that is also initially disabled. Let me right click on that, enable it, and I am auditing my backups. Now I have some backups happening automatically with my log shipping, and they're happening once every 15 minutes. We could either be patient and wait that long, or since I'm in a test environment, this isn't a real production environment, I can do this. Do not do this in your real environment. I'm going to set my backups to occur very frequently. Currently they're happening every 15 minutes. I'm going to set them to every 5 seconds. Only because I know my database is small enough that it takes only about 2 seconds for it to back up. That way I'll get some data a little quicker. So save that. So now my backups should be flying along. Go to my job activity monitor. I can see I'm getting backups. Refresh that. Maximize it so I can actually see the timestamp changing. So 5:28. So yeah, there it is. Every 3 seconds. That was at 26 or 2 seconds. 26 and 28. So it's generating some backups really quick. Go ahead and close that down. Go back to my audits folder. If I right click, there's a view audit logs. Selecting that, I can see my backups that are occurring. Right? See the date and time, the server instance that I'm looking at, action ID, class, it's a database, sequence number, and it's giving me exactly what I want for that audit. Now I could have also done this with T-SQL. We did it with the GUI. I could have also done this with T-SQL using the create statement for audits and the create statement for audit specifications. Doing it that way, you will get a few more options that you can configure. So for example, you can assign a GUID to your audit object, which can be helpful for tracking, but most of what you're going to typically use for creating audits you can actually get to through the GUI. Next, I want to get into a feature called the Dedicated Administrator Connection. It's available since SQL Server 2005, and what it is a diagnostic connection that allows you to connect to your server when other connections are not possible, such as you've got some renegade process running out there on your server that's eating up all the resources so that other users are getting very slow responses or maybe even no response at all. The server seems to be hung. You need to try and get in there and figure out what's going on. But if the current workload on the server is so high to the point where it's stopping other clients and other processes from operating or connecting, your client applications will probably also be prohibited. Well, the DAC allows you to get around that. Once again, it's a diagnostic tool that allows administrators, and yes, you have to be an administrator to access the SQL Server box to execute your various diagnostic queries or troubleshoot problems, but these need to be low resource tasks that you try and do. If you get in there and decide, hey, the whole server's trash and I want to maybe back up the database before I blow it away, you can't do that with the DAC. A backup is far too resource intensive to run under the DAC. You have to be a member of the SQL Server sysadmin role on the server in order to connect using the DAC. So typically some account that you've set aside for sysadmin access will work. And then if someone else is already logged into the DAC, you will not be able to. You will have to have them log out first so that you can log in, because only one DAC connection is allowed per instance of SQL Server. Now, one other side note on that. By default, in SQL Server 2008, the DAC is available for local connections only. So you typically won't run into this problem where somebody's logged in somewhere else, right, if you're only allowing local connections. But you can change that using the sp_configure built-in store procedure. You can actually change that to allow remote connections. But by default, right out of the box with the Enterprise Edition, you will have access locally using the DAC. And then, once again, any high resource type activity will not be allowed under the DAC. So anything that requires parallel queries or commands such as restore or backup will be prohibited. All right? But here, let's jump on over to our Veronica's database, and we're going to dummy up a locked up box and jump in there using the DAC. All right, I'm over on my Veronica's box, and I've just gotten the call from a panicked user, or actually several of them, saying nobody can connect to the database. They fear it has died. So you try to get in. You bring up your SQL Server Management Studio and you go to click connect. I'm not going to do that because there's really nothing wrong with my server. I'll get in. But let's say I click connect and I can't get in. So the connection fails. I'm going to just pretend it failed and click cancel. So I end up with my client interface up and running, and that's important. I have the client up and running. I'll show you another little problem later that will show you why that's important. So the client's up and running. Now what I want to do is establish a connection using my dedicated administration connection. I can do that not by doing connect. The reason for that is if I try and click connect here, it's going to attempt to connect and populate the Object Explorer. The Object Explorer is not supported under the DAC. Actually, here, let's just try it. I can do this, admin : that tells the Management Studio I want to use the dedicated administration connection. If I click connect here, I get an error. Dedicated administrative connections are not supported, which is in a period after, which is a little misleading. And then it has in parentheses Object Explorer. And it's really dedicated administrator connections are not supported when using the Object Explorer is what that message is intending to tell you. Right? So I'm going to cancel out of this. So the shell's up and running. If I simply say I want to open a new query, in order to run a query, and I have a query window up and running, it has to be connected to the server, right? Simply saying now admin : that will establish a connection to the server without populating the Object Explorer. So you want to bring up the shell in some manner that doesn't cause the Object Explorer to automatically populate. Clicking connect now, and I'm in. Notice here at the bottom it says admin : win08-SQL08. It lets me know I'm actually running using my dedicated administrator connection. So now I can do things such as use my DMV, my database management views, to look at the general health of my server. So I can look for things like the locks, select star from, and I didn't tell it what database to use. Start off with that. Back up here. Use Veronica's. So now I know what database to look at. And now tell it I want to look at sys.dm. And where am I getting this from? This is one of the database management views that we talked about in another segment. Trans_locks. And that'll give me information about locks. So I can see what, if anything, is locked. If I type it correctly, tran and not trans, no S. Get that off. There we go. So I can see, and I'm not going to see a lot of problems because there really are no problems in my database. I'm just pretending that we have a problem with this database. So here, let's see if we can't create a problem. I'm going to open a regular window because I can really get into my database right now, right? So I'm going to go ahead and open another window. If I were to leave that in a second time, I'd get a problem, but I'll do this. So now I have established a connection, and I put my mouse over that. It says I'm connected to Win08 SQL08, as opposed to over here I'm connected to admin : Win08 SQL08. So this window is still using my DAC, whereas this window is actually connected. Now, once again, we turned this around a little bit. We went backwards in that I opened this window with the assumption I could not connect to my server, but in reality we could, right? So I went on and connected to my server, and let's just run some crazy renegade SQL statement. Select star from sales.customers. I'm going to do something we never do, right? SQL 101 tells you never do this. Actually, my SQL 101 class doesn't mention it because you almost never do this. Cross join with sales.orders. What's that going to do? It's going to give me every possible permutation of the contents of both tables as a result set. Now if we type that correctly, press F5 to run it, and I've got some data, but notice it's still executing. And even with a database which is relatively small, such as mine, that's going to execute for quite a while and give you a massive result set. So I've got a runaway process. Now I can kind of cheat here because I can see if I put my mouse right here that my process ID is actually 56. If you look toward the right hand side of that pop-up, there's a 56 inside parentheses. Going back over to my DAC, well, once again, the assumption was this happened first, right? Someone somewhere on another box did this and has this renegade runaway process happening, and then as a result, now in practicality, this is not enough of a stressor on most SQL Server boxes in any environment to really bring it to its knees, but we just want to have something to play around with, right? So now I go back to my DAC. So I know from using my database management views that I've got a problem with, say, process 56. Using my DAC, I can get in and issue a kill 56, right? Let's go back over here. Still running away, right? It's up to 1 minute and 42 seconds of just chugging along doing nothing. But simply saying kill 56, I'll highlight and just run that only. Command completed successfully. If I go back to that other window, it's got a little red error message saying, hey, I don't know what happened, but somebody just pulled the plug on me. Basically, we just killed it. So it stops. It's now disconnected, and any resources that were tied up based on that renegade process are now released. But it was the DAC, the dedicated administrator connection, that allowed me to get in, poke around in my server, look at my DMVs, and figure out where the problem process was and kill it. Well, that brings us to the end of this video. But what did we talk about? First of all, we started with the activity monitor and talked about how it is typically your frontline defense whenever you have any problems with your SQL Server environment. Next, we talked about trace flags. We jumped right into looking at how you would use a trace flag, but one other thing I want to mention once again, trace flags are usually one small part of any debugging effort. So you will typically find various trace flags that are associated with different types of troubleshooting. For example, if you're troubleshooting replication versus backups, there'll be trace flags pertinent to that particular type of troubleshooting. Third, we talked about SQL Server reports and mentioned the long list of SQL Server built-in reports, and also briefly touched upon the fact that you can create your own with other tools that are also part of the SQL Server installation package. We looked at the Job Activity Monitor. The Job Activity Monitor is going to be your tool for monitoring the jobs that run under SQL Server Agent. We looked at the SQL Server logs, and we used the log viewer, which allowed us to look at the various logs. We saw that there were by default one current log and several archived logs. Next, we looked at the data management views, and we used them to query the server regarding its general health and various activities that are going on inside the server. You use them like you would any other view, but they're automatically created and maintained by SQL Server. Next, we used SQL Server audits and looked at how we can use that to audit activities such as backups. And then last but not least, we looked at the dedicated administrator connection. So with that, that brings us to the end of this video. Thank you so much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.